You know, the old saying goes, I think by Shakespeare, the world is a stage and we're all actors. So I don't know who designed this game, but we may be all playing. It's just it's not voluntary. But we may as well have fun doing it. The question is, in this game, in this world, how we're making sense of this world using our hearing. And that's basically what my talk is going to be about. And then we'll see maybe there are some ways to make it better. So I don't know, maybe I run out of time, so just in case I'll tell you the conclusion in the beginning. I'll repeat it in the end if we get there. But basically the idea is that today a lot of our interactions take place during some sort of electronic medium where we capture our speech and then it's transmitted and can be modified. And so most of the technologies that people use for this kind of oral communication are based on, they're trying to mimic the way we communicate acoustically. But now there is a tremendous potential because these are now objectified acoustic signals that can be manipulated in systematic ways. We can actually qualitatively change how we communicate by manipulating the signals. To do that, though, effectively, we need to know the rules of the game. We need to figure out how the sounds are processed physiologically and how people use them to achieve their goals. So here's a little roadmap, and I'll talk a little bit about the basics of hearing, just a short overview. Then we can talk about electric hearing, usually known as cochlear implants. And then I'll come back to audio dilation, time stretching, just to give you a little bit more background, and have some couple of parting thoughts. So, with hearing, even though we all have some sort of intuitive sense of what hearing is, if we go to the dictionary, then we'll learn that it's just some sort of perception of sounds, the power of perception of sounds. But the important thing to remember is that hearing has two components. One is the objective component. There is always some signal, some physical signal, be it acoustic or electric, but it's something that comes from the outside. And then there is a subjective experience of what happens. So if you have this waveform as your acoustic signal, and then you have a listener, and the listener hears what the waveform says, hopefully. So we use our hearing to get a sense of information about the world outside. So it has a specific purpose. It's not just there because somebody thought it would be cool to put hearing, but it evolved over millions of years to serve specific purpose for organisms. There is a lot that we communicate with the world by using our hearing. And so we take speech as an example. There are different kinds of information there. There is the linguistic message, right? So we need to know language, we need to understand the words, we need to know how they put together using syntax and so on. There is also a tremendous amount of information, which is usually called indexial information, about the speaker or any other sounds, what is happening in the world. So we may know whether it's a man or a woman speaking, a child maybe, whether this person is young or old, whether this person, from what area this person is, whether this person is from another country maybe. We may know what is the state of this person's health. So depression usually comes through the voice. We may know the person's affective state. Is this person angry? Is this person sad? And so on. So all of this, not that we are conscious of it, but these are all bits and pieces of information. Very often we are aware of the space where the message is heard. The acoustics of this place sort of color our perception. And people are very sensitive to this stuff, even though we're not consciously aware of it. So, not only speech, there are other sounds that we're hearing in the world. So, we usually hear, if we go back to our model, we usually hear events in action. So, our listener is standing on the road, and there is a car approaching, the car sends some sort of an acoustic signal, and then we have a sound of the car. I think, is there a sound here? I don't think it's playing. I think it was supposed to. Oh, I see. I should put that back. Yeah, it's okay. Right, excellent, thanks. So, well, you can imagine what the sound of the car is like. So the listener can jump away from the road and then not get hit by the car. So there is a kind of a very schematic example of what we can do. So we have the listener now standing somewhere in an intersection. There may be sounds around, and all the sounds are again. So all the sounds, it took time to recognize what they are, right? And the reason is that even though in physical terms, we talk about sounds in terms of frequency, in terms of intensity, in terms of phase, and we can, by knowing these three parameters, we can reconstruct every sound. Exactly. In reality, we're interested in what the objects are around us and how they interact with each other. So we're interested in information about the real world. So we are really biological pattern processors. And so we have our different senses, and here is one example of sensory system. And we basically use this modality, our hearing modality, or all different modalities, we perceive patterns, we process the patterns, and we want to get the underlying structure of the world around us. Right? We're not interested in these patterns per se, unless you're studying them. We're interested in the world around us, and even though the patterns are often distorted and incomplete, there should be enough to give us a sense of the underlying structure. Now, as organisms, when we are wrong about this, there are consequences. We get hit by cars, we get sick, we say the wrong things because we didn't understand the message, and so on. So there is feedback about how well we're doing, and hopefully we are made in the ways that we can compensate for our mistakes. There are simple patterns, and in vision, and maybe you've seen this in this class, I'm sure you've seen it somewhere else. You know, they were in psychology known as Johansson Dots, but basically it's somebody wherein you see little dancing dots on the screen, and then you can see a person walking, right? So you have very few pieces of information, they're just dots. If you look at a static image, you would never guess it's a person. But once they start moving, you see that there is a structure underneath it. And your knowledge of the world and how people walk allows you to interpret this dancing dots as a structure. Now, the interesting thing happens if you flip it around. It's much harder to figure out because usually people don't walk on the ceiling, right? Similar thing, if you see faces, familiar faces, very easy to recognize. You flip the faces upside down, much harder. So there are particular rules, and they obey particular laws of our behavior in this case. How we interpret the data, even though the amount of data may be the same, but the interpretation is different. Yes, in some ways, as in the example, you write the same thing but in different words, and you have different effects. So the simple cases, we can see there are patterns of 6 pure tones, and in the case on the left, the same 6 tones are arranged with wider silent intervals between them. And in the case on the right, they're arranged a little closer to each other in time. So listen to this pattern. Could you hear it? Or, okay, so basically, it's okay. But basically the idea is that you hear up and down, up and down, up and down. Just I showed with the schematic. That's pretty universal. Listen to this one. So this is an example of streaming. So the same exact frequencies you put closer together, and now our auditory system puts them in different streams. So you hear high and low patterns going their own way. So rather than having just one stream of sound going high, low, high, low, high, low, you hear two different streams of sounds. And that's basically a very basic way our auditory system operates. You change one parameter and you have a different result. I'm sure you've all heard about frequency, amplitude, and phase, so I'll just play you an example just to give you a sense of what a low frequency is. So this is 500 hertz. This is 1000 hertz. Right? And in psychology, we call this pitch. So pitch is a perception of frequency. It's not just the frequency, but the frequency, the physical frequency is the physical term. It's the main correlate of psychological pitch. And then we have amplitude. I think this, I don't know, it's not playing for some reason, but you can get a sense basically. I'll turn the volume on your radio so you know what intensity is like. And phase is basically the starting point of every cycle. So getting to the auditory system, we can talk about auditory periphery, things that happen where information enters, and central parts, which is where kind of extraction of information takes place. Figure out what things is. And there is some sort of function associated with each part, and so there are anatomical parts and what the parts do. So just to give you a little tour, we are all aware of our ear canals, the outer ears, the pinna, where the sound enters and serves as basically a funnel that captures the sound, brings them to the tympanic brain or the eardrum. Then you have the middle ear, the three bones that serve to amplify the sounds. Because in the inner ear you basically have fluid, and if you just have air to fluid transmission, most of the energy would be reflected and lost. So the middle ear functions as a sort of compensatory device to maintain the energy in the sound, especially in the frequency range, which is most important for speech perception. And so then there is the inner ear, the snail-shaped cochlea, the vestibule, and then you have semicircular canals that are involved in our sense of balance that you might have talked about already. So basically there is, as the sound enters into the inner ear, so this is the snail-shaped cochlea uncoiled, and of these two lines, right? And so there is something that's known as a traveling wave, and the traveling wave, because it's in fluid, right, goes there, and then the structure in the middle is the basilar membrane, and you basically, just like if you have a string, it's like a wave going up and down. Now the neat part about this traveling wave is that different regions of the cochlea are sensitive to different frequencies. So kind of if you think about a piano, you have highs and lows. So depending on where the maximum point of vibration of the traveling, where is the maximum amplitude of the traveling wave, that point is most sensitive to this particular frequency. So you can see if you have very low frequency, it goes all the way to the apex, to the end of the cochlea. If you have high frequency, it's closer to the base. And so what that allows us is to have a frequency map. So what the inner ear really does is very basic spectral analysis. So the output of the sensory system of the cochlea is some sort of a spectrogram. I mean, it's not really a spectrogram. It's not. FFT is an approximation of what may be happening there. So fast Fourier transform, right? But there is maybe more, a little different. But the idea that it does spectral analysis is definitely there. Now, the actual process of converting the hydraulic energy in the inner ear, the mechanical energy, into the neural electrochemical energy, that is done by inner hair cells. There are inner and outer hair cells, with inner hair cells acting as the biological transducer, which actually converts the hydraulic energy into neural energy. And the outer hair cells, they basically create the optimal coupling conditions for the inner hair cells. So they can kind of adjust the size, the parameters of that space, so that the bending of the cilia, the hair-like structures on top of the hair cells, so the cilia of the inner hair cells is bent optimally to transmit the sound, right? So and when you have this bending, as you can see here, because the wave goes up and down, when you have this bending, that's when the ion channels open, and that's how you get from hydraulic to neural electrochemical. So that's where magic happens. Now after this, you go to the auditory nerve, and then you have the ascending afferent pathway. So you go to the cochlear nucleus, other brainstem structures, through lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus, medial geniculate body, and finally to the auditory cortex. So this is just to show, you don't need to remember this, but this is just to show you the path of what happens after that. And then, very importantly, even though most of the science right now is done on the ascending auditory system, we know that there exists a descending one, which is represented maybe even stronger anatomically than the ascending one. And what it results in, so you can go from the cortex all the way down practically to the cochlea. And so you have the situation where you have ascending pathways that send information from the periphery to the central region, to the cortex. And you also have the descending one. And so it gives you this sort of sensory cognitive interplay where your existing knowledge of the world can go back and create and affect how the information goes up. So it's wrong to think about information as this is just sort of one-way street. There is input, processing, and output. There are a lot of feedback loops, which makes sense. We know we learn things. We're not born with knowledge of every possible contingency. So, but for some reason, traditionally, and perhaps because it's much easier in terms of practical aspects to study ascending systems than descending and their interactions, we know right now more about the ascending one. Here's a little schematics of how things, there's a number of theories. This is one I think that captures some of the essence of what I was just talking about. Let's say this is your typical input. You go to a bar, there is some music, or restaurant, there are people talking. So these are different waveforms, and it's all mixed. Now, your ears just get one waveform each, right? And that waveform is complex. It has a little bit of everything. There is no separation in the signal coming in of one person versus another versus a musical instrument. It's all there in this mush. Then you have the spectral analysis at each cochlea, and then somewhere before it gets to the cortex, in the brain stem, and maybe a little bit beyond that, medial geniculate body, you get features extracted, differences between ears, the temporal modulation. So there is a kind of a higher level analysis done on those waveforms, done based on the spectral analysis performed before. Then you get to the auditory belt areas and the cortical areas, and then you start segregating. Right now, we know that this is Joe, and this is Jane, and this is some jazz playing in the background. So all goes into just what you experience with pure tones. We all do this where different streams of information are formed. And so we get some linguistic analysis, we hear music, and so on. So there is the information processing somewhere in cortical areas. Now the point here is that you can see there are two arrows. There is the forward process, right? And there is the backward process. Because say you kind of heard somebody, right? You know, this is this person, but then for whatever reason, part of the message gets obscured. So you actually need to go back and figure things out. And so while some of this may still be kept somewhere for a limited period of time, you can still go back and access some of these features. So there is this kind of looping process that's going on that allows you to clarify, kind of, you know, think about the digital zoom. You can sort of capture something, but then you can go back and search for it a little more. So even though traditionally we talk about sensory processing, perception, cognition as sort of different things, and there is the bottom-up and top-down words, and the perceptual complexity of information goes from sensory to cognition. The concepts are there, but in reality they're much closer together, right? And we have, you know, if anybody who looked at the brain knows how intertwined things are there, right? So when we put 3-4 different boxes on the screen and say this is how things work, you know, this is maybe a good attempt to make progress, but we should always keep in mind the real picture where things are interconnected immensely. So here is just a little illustration of things that happen as low as the brainstem, right? There is a speaker who says something. This is the waveform, there is the ear and the brain. And so what you see on the left is the sound that comes out from the speaker.
Da.
It's a synthetic syllable, it doesn't matter what it is. And then we can do this thing. We can put some electrodes, surface electrodes we call them, on the skin of our head. And basically we can compare what comes from one electrode to what comes to another electrode. 3 electrodes would be enough. This is done with 3 electrodes. And we can figure out what the areas around the brainstem may be hearing. So basically we record the electrical activity from the head, and then we can convert it back to sound. And we hear something like this. So this was the
Da.
sound that was heard, and this is the recording from the skin of our skull, from 3 electrodes, converted back to sound. So we play around with it, and then you have, let's say there is a fundamental frequency, right? So you can have something like this,
Da.
and this is what we can record. And then we raise the fundamental frequency, all other things being equal.
Da.
Right? Higher pitch. This is me.
Me.
So basically you can see the fidelity of our brainstem. Now remember, this is recorded from the skin, this is not recorded from the sides. So this is with all the other electrical nonsense that's going on in our heads. This is just because we repeat it so many times. This is about 3,000-4,000 time repetition. We can throw out the random noise. But you can see that our brainstem is very faithful to the original signal and does a pretty good job in doing it. What we also know is that the experiences the person has are influencing how the signals are transcribed by the brainstem, are coded by the brainstem. So if you have musical training, people with musical training can track the pitch of the sound, the fundamental frequency of the sound much better. They are more resistant to noise as adults when they hear the syllable in the background of the noise. Whether or not we know a language, people have tried tonal languages like Chinese versus non-tonal languages, and when you play the sounds, people from tonal languages track the pitch much better, right? And interestingly, there is a number of non-auditory abilities, at least at the surface, non-auditory abilities like reading, that relate to how well our brainstem can code the sound. So that kids who later become poor readers and are at risk for dyslexia, actually several years before they actually learn to read, they already have decreased brainstem transcription. So these are interesting ways to think about, because it shows that there is this sensory cognitive interplay happening in our brain at all times. So this was sort of the little overview of the basics of hearing. And now I'd like to move on. I don't know, if there are questions, I can answer them now. We can leave them for later, so that you have whatever works. So switching gears a little bit, what I talked about before was the classic acoustic hearing that we all do, where sound comes into our ears as an acoustic signal. There is now a lot of people in the world who get the sound in electrical form from the beginning. And this can be seen as sort of trying to reverse engineer the human auditory system. But I guess that's all what scientists do anyway. But this is actually taking it to the next level, where you do things that are biologically, that we were not designed, kind of, that our bodies were not designed to do. Just for a little taste of history, you know, people who were pretty smart did pretty silly things with electricity when it came around. So putting, poles, electrically charged poles in your hearing seemed like a good idea at the time. And there was actually, so this was about 50 volts, because it was the chemical cells that Volta used. And then there was actually his student who doubled the voltage. We don't know what happened to the students. But anyway, the idea was lingering out there, and when people, surgeons in France, in US, were doing surgeries where they could have access to the auditory nerve, and you know, the brain is not sensitive. Once you can have it open, you can poke around, people don't feel any pain. So people started sort of putting electrodes and saying, oh, can you hear this, can you hear that? And you know, there are sometimes medical reasons to do that. Because for example, even now, when people do some sort of brain surgeries, they want to stimulate areas around the site so they know they're not messing up really important areas. So the patient may be awake, and that's one way in the process they learn where things are also. So it's not just silly. But anyway, people started experimenting, and in the 70s, the idea caught up a little bit that you can actually have, because of this tonotopic organization, remember what tonotopic organization refers to, this frequency map that you can have in the cochlea, it's also mimicked in the auditory nerve. That you can sort of stimulate different sites and give representation of signals electrically. Now, it's kind of instructive to think that now that we know that cochlear implants work very well, that at the time the main scientific establishment was against the idea. And there were good reasons. So if you just look at science, people who were key neurophysiologists at the time argued that if you have stimulation of the nerve, you would have maybe a buzz about 400 hertz. Basically, you would stimulate all the neurons at the same time by applying electrical current. There is the refractory period for every neuron where it cannot fire. Every time the neuron fires, it has to go to sleep before it can fire again. And it would say, you know, the neurons would just basically be on and off. So there were good reasons based on the science, but because there were some people who were really enthusiastic about it and they really believed in it, they just pulled together and they did it. And even though people say, well, we would have gotten there anyway, just maybe a little longer, maybe you didn't do it, you know, you can always find details, but I think it's interesting to remember that people who know the most expert, they're not always right. And so don't be afraid to follow up on your ideas. So right now, you know, this 100,000 people, now it's probably more like 200. You know, people started doing this in India, in all third world countries, and so it's growing. We have, you know, we'll soon have 1 million people who have just electric hearing. Now, another thing that's kind of interesting about implants is that in the beginning, people at that time already knew something about speech, and they said, well, you know, we don't really need to feed all the information through the implant. We know what the important things are in speech, and we'll just feed those. We'll kind of prepackage the signal to just extract the perceptually salient information. And then there were people who said, no, we'll just give everything. And so it turned out that the second way was much better. That giving the brain all the information as faithfully as you can is much better than prepackaging it for the brain. That because we are these good parent processors, that we want to figure out what the structure is, rather than giving the structure and then saying, you know, you can relax now. You can actually just give everything and say, okay, find what's important. And we do that. So it is just, okay, so basic components of the implant, right? It's a microphone, just regular microphone, just a smaller one, omnidirectional usually. It's a signal processor, and there is a transmission system. How does it get from the processor to the implant? And then the implant is basically a link of electrodes that's put in the brain. So it looks kind of like this. This is an old one. This is the signal processor. This is the part that sits on the outside, the transmitter. And on the inside, there is the receiver here's the electrode array right here. See, so you get sense of the scale. So basically, another way to look at it, this is the cochlea, right? These are the 2.5 turns that humans have in the cochlea. And so the electrode array sits basically here. It's usually inserted through the round window, so it coils around the cochlea, goes to all the different sides. And so this is how it sits on the inside. And then this is now the signal processors are like hearing aids. They sit behind the ear, and the construction is held together by a magnet. There is a magnet on the inside, on the outside. So the person with the implant, if it gets bothered by something, can just take off the magnet. That's it. The world goes quiet, unless the person has tinnitus, which is quite common.
Why is that common? I mean,
tinnitus?
That's not common to the procedure,
No,
but
no,
to the person.
To the person, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So very
it's
often,
not induced by.
well, I mean, it may stimulate something. It's a little grayer. The thing is that once the nervous tissues get stimulated, right, and then you just remove it, you still have things going on, right? There's still
But it would go away after a bit, right?
for some it does, for some. I mean, it's kind of just like with people with normal hearing have tinnitus. It comes and goes. You know, there isn't really a good understanding of. There are many things. It's a many factor thing. So, looking inside, what happens on the signal processor? On top, you see the different components we just talked about. At the bottom, basically, the signal processor, you have an array of bandpass filters that kind of tries to mimic the different sides of the cochlea, right? Different frequencies. That then you extract the envelope of each band, right? Basically, if you have a waveform, the envelope is you trace all the peaks of each cycle. And then on each electrode, you have basically a biphasic pulse, which is there all the time. And the envelope modulates the amplitude of the pulses. Right? So the envelope of the real waveform modulates amplitude of the pulses. So if you have this as a waveform of the syllable sa, so this is the high frequency energy for s, this is a, and so the high frequencies, you can see the bandpass filter has the high frequencies in the upper band, and the low frequencies for the vowel in the lower bands. And here's the envelope, and you can see how the pulses are modulated according to each band. So that's basically the main idea. I thought it would be good, you know, to have, you know, we know sort of the process, the technology behind it, but the experiences are quite unique. And the unique part about this is that unlike kids who learn to hear for the first time and don't have language, these are adults who can usually express themselves. And so after many years of hearing nothing, all of a sudden they get turned on. So this is just the thing that I found yesterday, but I couldn't find the book that I really wanted, where this woman, the woman wrote a book about it. And the first time I read it, it really kind of made an impression on me. She said, you know, when I was turned on for the first time, I felt really bad because I thought it failed. I did not feel anything. And only after about 20-30 minutes, I realized that the strange sensations throughout my body that felt like vibrations were actually sound. I mean, think about this, right? That what we so automatically describe as an experience of sound without even thinking, because that's how we go, this is our everyday world. To these people, they have to figure out what are these things, right? The brain looks for these patterns, there is something different, you know, that's coming in, and then gets a sense of what, that must be the sound. So it doesn't have this sort of automatic thing, same thing for everybody, one size fits all. So this is also interesting, you know, because the person says the first was just a buzz, and it was loud, and this person felt dizzy. And remember, the sense of balance is right there. So there is some leakage of stimulation there too. And actually, it's quite common for people to have balance problems after surgery for a little bit. Then things get better usually. So she talks about CI moments, right? The first time being able to realize that it's a car passing by. You know, people say that all of a sudden they realize that when you have the turning signal in the car, that it makes a sound, you know, because there's synchronization. The funniest one was from this patient I saw, and she was very funny. She said, when I got my implant, I realized that when I fart, other people can hear it. So, you know, it's silly, right? But these are adults, and all of a sudden they have this new channel of information, right? And they kind of embrace it. So the question, of course, how, you know, the technology is capable of doing something, and it's clear at this point. How can we make it work better? One question was the number of electrodes. Now we have about 30,000 neural fibers in the auditory nerve that transmit information to the brain. And the thought was, well, we'll just make more electrodes, and we'll increase the resolution, the spectral resolution of the incoming sound. So far it hasn't really worked. I mean, it's more electrodes are better than one. But after about 12, 16 electrodes, it doesn't seem to be making that much of a difference. There are different reasons and different understandings of why that may be happening. One may be because there is the crosstalk between electrodes, so the electric field basically spreads. And also you have to realize that in reality these old people have damaged ears. That's why they get the cochlear implants. And very often the way the electrodes sit inside the cochlea doesn't actually match, you know, the surgeon just blindly puts it there, shoves it in. But it doesn't actually match the map that is there. So you have this sort of large mismatches in frequency of what should be there versus what's coming in. And sometimes it's really amazing that people can actually do so much having such a poor system.
Is there a way to calibrate somehow for that mismatch?
Well, so far the best that works is just people going around and experiencing the sound. But people work on this, you know, because sometimes people have, let's say, preserved hearing in one ear and no hearing in the other one, and people try to see, can you kind of do pitch matching and so on. So, but it's not, there isn't sort of yet a magic kind of answer to it. So where you insert the implants? Now, right now, basically, electrode array is coiled around the modulus, which is the center of the snail. People are working of maybe putting electrode directly through the bone to the auditory nerve, because now you have to stimulate through the bones. So you have much larger area, you have to apply more current. So these are all ideas that haven't paid out yet, but doesn't mean that they won't in the future. How far do you insert the electrodes? Now people work with short arrays so that your low frequencies remain unaffected, because some people still have preserved hearing in low frequencies, so they just insert short arrays and stimulate high frequency, and this is called the hybrid acoustic electric hearing, which people seem to do better with that, even though that's very different, you know, it's qualitatively very different kinds of information. Type of stimulation. So in general, the sense is that unfortunately over the last 15 years the technology in cochlear implants kind of got stagnated. People do incremental progress, but it's really incremental, and people throw out this idea and that idea, people try new things, and at some point it may pan out, but it sort of seems that in many ways we have reached the limit of what is possible with the current technology, with just putting electrodes there. Now, you know, if you combine it with some stem cell regrowth of tissues and so on, you know, it may still come back. It's not that it's the ultimate limit, but unless there is some sort of a qualitative technological jump, it seems like the progress is slow. So, so how do we do it? Well, we can skip that. I kind of talked about this. So one thing I'd like to talk about is that sometimes to get a sense of how we optimize the implants. We don't need to necessarily have the patient with an actual implant. We can get an idea by using normal hearing listeners, by simulating the information that a person with an implant would ideally have. And of course, the interesting thing here is that you don't actually have to do surgery and mess with people's brains and have all the risks. And you can quickly do it in your lab. So you can answer also all those questions of the design can be answered. And the idea is that here's the slide that I had before, is that you do exactly the same thing, but here instead of these biphasic pulses that stimulate the nerve, you either have a pure tone at the frequency, at the center frequency of the band, or you just have white noise, and you modulate white noise with the band, with the envelope of each band. So here's, say you have a one-channel implant where things got started. So here's your input signal, right? I won't play it yet. So waveform spectrogram, and here's your white noise. It is basically the signal and carrier concept, right? So you have a carrier signal, which is white noise in this case, and you have what rides on that signal, which is the envelope of the actual speech that was played. So white noise sounds like this. And here's the spectrum of white noise. And here's the halfway rectified envelope of the, this is basically the filter that was used there. This is the halfway rectified envelope, and then you apply basically this envelope to this white noise, and that's what it sounds like now. So if you had a one-channel implant that just gave you the envelope information, that's what you get. Now, it doesn't mean that it would sound, the experience of the sound would be the same, but the information there would be that. So then you have a bank of 4 electrodes, 4 bandpass filters, getting a little more frequency resolution. So here are your filters, and they're logarithmically spaced to mimic the logarithmic organization of the hearing system. So now try this again. Now notice on the spectrogram of this noise, white noise modulated by these envelopes, you start seeing a little bit more of a structure emerging, right? So this was nothing, right? Now you start getting something there. And so this is what that sounds like. Okay, tell me, raise your hand when you figure out what the speaker says. I'm sure you all heard it at some point in your life. It's from a movie. Okay, so now we go to 8 channels. Again, see the structure is emerging, right? So you can see, I mean, it doesn't look like the original, but it's starting, you can see sort of this darker areas, the form and structure. That sounds like this. And anybody? Play one more time. No, I thought I had 16, but I think. Yeah, who said Austin Powers? You get a name. Talk to Bob.
Who was that?
Okay, now everybody's got what he said, right? Everybody knows the expression, the Austin Powers, right? So now I'll play it again. No?
No.
Okay, I'll play, this is the original.
Oh, groovy, baby.
See, you know. So now here's this very interesting effect that I will play all those vocoded versions now and see how you will be wondering, how couldn't I get it? Right? Remember this sensory cognitive interplay going back and forth? So now it went down. You've limited the field. You know what to listen for in this mess of the acoustic information. You know how to carve the important stuff. You have the template. That's why when you try to figure out how many channels do people need to get something, you're always wrong because you already know what to listen for. So coming back to our listener on the street corner, if this listener now has a one-channel device, things may be like this. Even though you know what the sounds are, it still sounds pretty distorted, right? Except for footsteps. Because footsteps, to begin with, are broadband, temporally patterned signals, right? So it's much easier to deal with them. Once you have to have spectral components, that becomes hard. But then you go to 16 channels.
That was terrifying.
Crying babies are pretty terrifying.
Yeah, I know.
This is just to give it extra spice. There was actually one interesting story. There is, in addition to cochlear implants, people now do brainstem implants. So it's basically higher area. Go somewhere to about cochlear nucleus. They don't work as well as cochlear implants because in that area of the brain, that frequency map is not as well organized. So you can't map the input frequencies so well. So, but some people are doing pretty good, especially, I think I skipped over a little bit, but you know, patient experience matters a lot. How old the person is, how long the person was hearing before he got the implant, so the memory of the sounds, kind of, what's already there. Other issues, demographic factors a little bit maybe. So this guy, he had, you know, very often in the US at least, the FDA-approved brainstem implants are done for NF2 tumors, right? Basically, they have to extract the tumor, and in the process, they cut the nerve because they cannot separate the tumor from the nerve. So this guy basically was here until he had the surgery, and then he had an implant very soon. So his base to build on, where to map the new sensations, was very strong. And he was amazing. I would never think he has an implant. He picked up on my accent, so all the things that people with implants have a hard time figuring out, he could do. But the most amazing thing about him, he had twins. And he said, you know, I can tell my twins apart by the sound of their cries, and my wife cannot. And that really gave me a pause. This guy has no spectrum, or very little of it. How could he do it better than his wife? I thought he was just fooling me, but you know, he was an honest guy. I think he really was. So my sense, my answer of what may be happening is that his wife has access to the spectral cues and to the envelope temporal cues. He only has good access to the envelope cues. Because when we listen to cries, we pay attention to the spectrum much more. The timbre and the sort of of different voices. And these are twins, they're not different. But because this information is as good as non-existent to him, he's forced to pay attention to the envelope cues. And he says, one twin, he goes, and the other one goes, And so, because the temporal cues are there, he can actually focus on them and get the information. So sometimes
Less is more.
less is more, right? He can actually do something with his implant. And that moves us to auditory training. Because what happens now with adults is that they get an implant, audiologist plays around a little bit, sets it, says, come back in a month. The person comes out of the hospital. Well, they can take it off, but this is like a mess, right? This is somebody who might not have heard for 20 years. And there is right now, for kids there is some training people try to do. For adults, even though kids actually figure things out quicker. But for adults there is nothing. I mean, they come back in a month, they check the implant, come back in 3 months. they talk to friends, they go to clubs, whatever they decided, they listen to tapes. And so, because the technology is starting slowing down, there is a realization that the ear is really attached to the brain, and the brain can do all those things. So we can optimize how the brain processes information, and we can, just like with this example, we can let people focus on the cues that are important. And there are different kinds of training. There's the cognitive training. There are all different aspects of hearing. The speech training, the musical training. People now care much more about music with their implants, and they don't want to hear, they say, all music sounds like rap music right now. But they really want to hear classical. And so how do we do that? So there's actually, I won't go there now, but there's we've been doing training studies. You can go to this site. This actually was put together based on our previous study. The interface was put together by an undergraduate student at UIC. And that's kind of work in progress still. We're not using it yet, but you can play around with it. Now we're also working not only just identifying, playing with environmental sounds, but also sequences of sounds. When a sound sequence tells you a story, right? So you have something like this. Used to work. Well, anyway, another time. But basically, trying to see beyond just being able to say this is a baby crying, this is somebody snoring, whether your ability to code all the sequences, if you know the sequence of events, if you can use higher order information about objects in the world accessible through audition, can you then interpret this better? Because we always use context. So we're trying to help people identify those context cues in their everyday interaction. So just to remind you, things travel both ways. And just to finish off this part is the idea of a little study that we did. We had people come in and test how well they identify environmental sounds. Many people actually, even though they can deal with speech okay, they have problems with other sounds. And with speech, when you talk to somebody, you understand when you're not understanding somebody. With environmental sounds, it may be just noise that you don't recognize. But you don't recognize most of it, so you just write it off, whatever. So we wanted to look, and people mostly were focusing on speech before, so we wanted to look at environmental sounds. So people would come in, take a test, go home, come back in a week, take another test, do nothing in between. Then we would give them laptops, they would go do environmental sound training every day, maybe for an hour, five days. Come back, do a test again, and come back in a week, and we see how much stays of that training. So we did it both with people using simulations. So these are young adult, normal hearing listeners listening to 4-channel simulations. And these are the red guys. And the blue ones are actual cochlear implantations. Just to orient you, the spin is the speech and noise test. So these are complete sentences. And the CNC are syllables like duck, shoot, etc. And environmental sounds are just being able to identify this is a baby crying, this is somebody burping, all kinds of things. So what you can see here is that for normal testing with simulations, of course, environmental sounds improve the most. But what's interesting, even though these people were trained with environmental sounds, they actually improved with speech as well. So there is the generalization of Lauren effect, which was exciting to us. Because this thing, so far at least, what's been done, it doesn't transfer the other way. So if you get better with speech, you don't actually get better with environmental sounds. And I have an idea why that may be the case, but another time. But what's really exciting is that when you do this with actual cochlear implantations, things work the same way, very similarly. So you still get an improvement. And so that's why we now try to do this online, so that we don't have to give people laptops. Because in reality, if you're an implant patient and you not just want to do a study, you want to improve yourself, You want to go to a website and be able to train yourself, right? So we're trying to kind of make it more realistic. And if you want to know a little more about the study, I guess you'll post the slides. You can go here. There's a little like 5-10 minute piece on WBEZ. You can hear patients. I mean, it's a little more personal, so it's a nice thing. So pushing it to the next level, right? We now have people who don't need acoustics at all to have a sensation of sound. We have people who plug their implants into their computer, their CD player, or their cell phone, and it never becomes the acoustic sound, it's just electric. So if you sort of push it, and it's all done through radio frequency transmission from the outside and from the inside, you can easily have them listen to the radio by just saying, what am I listening to today? I'd like some jazz, right? If we are there, another way. And remember, the cochlear implants are not anywhere near where normal hearing is. So don't take it too far. I'm just saying that in principle, just as a concept, it is possible to think about if you can volitionally control your implant device, right? And there are some ways people can do certain things. You can potentially just you can be sitting and switching channels mentally, right? So another thing, we capture the normal audible range, right? Why can't we capture the infrasound and the ultrasound and then compress it to the normal range? I don't know if that would be how it would be processed, but it is possible to do something like this. So anyway, some ideas to think about. So a few words about the audio dilation, time stretching. How does it work? Why does it work? So we communicate in different environments, right? Bars, people talking, music playing. We can be talking to somebody who is half asleep. We may be half asleep. Landing planes, kind of an important thing to get it right. Talking on the phone when it's really noisy and you're really stressed and you want to really not to lose that $1 million. Human-computer interaction, right? A lot of speech now. When you call your credit card company, you either get somebody in India or you get the computer voice, right? That says there is no more option now to press 0 and get to the operator. You have to go through the 13 options and then start from the beginning. So how we understand computer voices is kind of important too, and how well they understand us. And of course the best thing is when you can talk one-on-one and it's quiet, but you still need to have something to talk about at that point. The moon landing and whether people speak English on the moon is a different story. But the idea is that there are all different kinds of situations that we need to account for. Now, the graphics didn't come out. Must be one of those Mac PC things. Anyway, there is I don't know if you can see it from there, but there is a waveform of one speaker, and then it gets progressively covered by waveforms of other speakers. So there is something that we call energetic masking, and it's basically when you have energy of another signal masking the energy in the signal of interest, the target signal. And as you get this overlap, there is less and less audible energy of the target speech. So basically you get these fragments, the mosaic of the target speech, and presumably if you can stream those sounds, then you can use those fragments to put together what the person is saying. But then there is also the informational masking, because all these other speakers, even if you can segregate their voices, they tell you different things. And so the information may be similar. I guess many of you may have heard about the cocktail party effect, right? When things jump out or you cross things between ears and so on. Because if the information is similar, you can take words from one speaker and mix them with words from another speaker or so on. Which stream do you attend to? They're all pretty. As people get older, they get progressively worse in the segregating of information, presumably due to having more difficult time inhibiting irrelevant information, among other things. Now here's an example of kind of the normal versus degraded signal. So when the auditory periphery that does this pre-processing, the sensory coding, let's say you go to the brainstem, a little beyond. See the word in the beginning, panel A? Even if you look sort of to the lower part of that panel A, or to the corner, the word involuntary will still jump at you. It will be easy to access with your peripheral vision. When the word was not coded well, it's kind of blurred, right? The image of this whole thing is blurred, and so it doesn't jump at you as easily. So you have to work much harder. It's still there, you can still read it, but it's not as automatic that you can get to that word. And a similar thing, so if you have two sentences that intertwine, and you can sort of use this blurring as an analogy, and this sort of thing decays over time, right? So you have a kind of a window of opportunity when you have to get the information. So you have to, so here, this is the sentence, the type of sentence we're working with. Ready, Baron, go to read free now. I'll explain what that means. But here, just to recall how that works, this is a regular tempo.
A stray cat gave birth to kittens.
The
A stray cat gave birth to kittens.
And again, it's not a speaker saying it's slower. It's a signal processing that was done to make it slower. So in an experiment, we played around with this paradigm that was developed by Air Force researchers, where you have things like a flight controller may say, like, ready, one of these four signs, ready, tiger, go to one of the colors, one of the numbers now. So ready, Baron, go to green 4 now, and so on. And so in the task that we did, which is a little different from how it was intended, people had to listen for this one keyword, and then, so there may be 3 talkers, right, all saying Baron, Ringo, Arrow, but they have to listen to the Baron talker and then say, where does the Baron talker need to go? And so if you get the sort of version regular tempo,
Ready, Baron, go to green now.
okay, possible. This is the
Ready, Baron, go to white green now.
a little easier. And this is the easy part because this is a female talker giving you the target information. So her stream is segregated much easier to begin with. Now if they're all male talkers,
Ready, Baron, go to red 2 now.
good luck. Right?
Ready, Baron, go to green 4 now.
Right? So you can play around. Anyway, this is the result. The blue is regular tempo, the red is time stretching, and this basically referred to different conditions that we used. So one target 2 talkers, one target 3 talkers, and so on. So I won't go into that, but basically it's the number of talkers talking at the same time and the number of talkers you have to pay attention to. And you can see, you can really get measurable effects. This is on the order of 20% correct, right? So 20% correct is not just statistically significant, but it's practically relevant when you can improve this. And that you have on the left you have young adults, and on the right you have older adults. So you can see that the older adults don't do as well in general, but the effects are there for them pretty much with the same magnitude. Now, it was interesting for us to look at the accuracy when we changed the task a little bit, and we said, well, you have to tell us if Baron and maybe another couple of talkers are still there, but now you just tell us whatever is the color number of the speaker on either left or right, and we'll cue people to listen to left or right. So once that happens, it doesn't really matter how many speakers are there. Once people separate these sources of information, that one task is just to pay attention to the left versus right, and the other task is to say whether Baron and maybe arrow are there. Then the accuracy of Baron, the accuracy that was affected by the number of talkers so much, see there's the zigzagging line, it becomes flat, right? You separate the task. The cognitive resources that you needed on both tasks, you separated. So right now you freed some of them. Now, this is where we try to correlate these conditions with measures of working memory performance. And you can see the correlations are huge on many of them, which basically shows that to do this stuff, you have to have good working memory. Because what you do is you go back and forth. And remember when you have these fragments and you need to keep them in memory while you try to figure out what's the best fit? And so people seem to do that. And what these correlations mean, that people who are have better working memory, are better at taking advantage of time stretching and doing this task in general. So in order to take advantage of time stretching, you actually have to have good working memory, because you have to, it can only help you if you have things where you can keep it. I might have, well, just as a back thought along the same lines, in speech, you remember I talked about energetic masking and informational masking. You can think about input speech as having two qualities. You know, there is a clarity to input speech, and then you have something like physical integrity of the speech, right? How fragmented it, how masked by other signals it is. And you can think about informational complexity as two kind of orthogonal concepts, although they may be related in the end. And so if you just have too few fragments to build up something from it, time stretching is not going to help you, because there's just little information. But if you have the information, which is enough to perceive it, but it's just, there's other competing information, there are other people that are telling you something that you need to attend to, something potentially interesting, then by giving you more time, you can actually buy yourself extra time to sort out information. So time stretching should be most effective if this whole thing works, as I think it does. When you have to sort out information, not when you have to dig out the signal, which is masked energetically. Right? And that's sort of the key. I haven't had time to put up the slide that would show the model, but hopefully that gives an idea. So coming back to the big idea, we now have this opportunity to capture electronic communication signals and to mess them up in creative ways. And if we know the rules by which we interpret them, we can really change the way information is communicated, and we can change its effect on behavior, not just on speaking behavior, but also driving and other tasks that tie into that. So there is a great unrealized opportunities. And just like in the beginning, when people realize that they can record music, they just try to get the best quality of a recorded piece, which is a noble goal, right? But then people said, oh, well, we can create a new kind of music, just playing electronic music and doing things that regular acoustic instruments are not capable of. So this is a little bit like that. We can move from just copying and mimicking basic acoustic communication to creatively changing this. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit so you can do your own reading, maybe. There is a book, there is a guy, he's in computer science at MIT, Alex Pentland. And he has a book out, which is a small book, it's called Honest Signals, where he tries to use this biological information framework, where we communicate by honest signals, meaning that they're not the signals in our language, they're just sort of this nonverbal communication. And in terms of acoustics, he looks at kind of the volume of the voice, the turn-taking behavior, the fundamental frequency changes. So all the things that have nothing to do with what you're actually trying to communicate. And he's done very impressive studies where he showed that for investment decisions, for diagnosing depression, you don't really need to listen to what people say. Because very often we make our decision in real time about whether we want to buy something, sign up for a plan, invest our money, whether or not somebody is really giving us good advice or not on whatever it is, not by actually being experts in what they're saying, because in many ways we're not experts, but by analyzing the subtle cues. Now, I think the starting point from that, what that lets you do, if you know how people interpret information, you can then modify information. So, for example, if you're talking to somebody on Skype or on the phone, you can insert delays that can change the information flow. You can manipulate the volume of information. So this is kind of going beyond, but there are ways to affect interactions by sort of this big brother approach, right? If you do it intelligently. Anyway, so I thought it's an interesting way to think about it. So this is it.
So you can turn someone who's unsympathetic into a sympathetic character by manipulating this.
Potentially, right.
Yeah.
That's the idea. So if you let's say there is a monitor and you see that there is a frustration building up, you can do subtle manipulations of the, at least this is sort of concept.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of an app. You're talking to someone who really aggravates you.
Right.
And you don't want to sound like a jerk to this person. You put it on, be a nice person, or modify whatever it is.
Well, you can make this actually. You can make this person sound like a chipmunk, so you can laugh at it, right? That's even easier.
That's true. That's true.
Right? You can actually do all these things. So kind of sometimes the mental tricks we do to deal with aggravating person, you can actually do them. So anyway, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now, or you can reach me.
Quick question. Last week, one of the speakers talked about the idea of augmentics. They use with haptics. The idea that if you overcorrect for something, then when you took that overcorrection away, it would learn how to cognitively correct. Do you think that would be possible with audio as well? So right now we're working under the assumption that if we slow it down, we will be able to cognitively take more in or change cognitive load. But if we train people by having them listen to sped up audio over a course of time, do you think that the brain or the cognitive ability, the way that they process the sound would, once you took that stimuli away, do you think that it would slow down the normal rate of speed kind of, I guess?
There are some programs. One of them is Brain Fitness, which I think is actually based in April. And they're targeted for people with hearing impairment who need practice. It's a computer training program to basically optimize their speech perception. And they have cognitive component, but they also have this thing where they speed up certain parts of speech and progressively lead you to, it sounds like faster and faster speech. And I'm really, my intuition is it's not the real trick that they do, but it's more just that they do exactly what you suggested. There seem to be results where people do better up to that, even after a period of time. But this is targeted as kind of helping people, older adults, to deal with noisy situations and so on. So it's very possible that if you do something like this. Now, I haven't never looked at it in detail. I do know that in the 60s, when people started playing with time compression, in a little more crude form, but it was still done reasonably well, they found that even if you compress to kind of, let's say, 70% of the original speech, so it sounds pretty fast. Faster than you can produce with a normal vocal tract, put it this way. People, the intelligibility, which is being able to repeat words that you hear, can be 100%. What suffers is comprehension. Because your ability to process information, if you have to answer questions about the weather passage you just heard, or you hear traffic on the news, and basically have to decide, so which way do I go? That part seems to be really affected by speeding up speech, not your ability to just repeat what speaker says. Now, how much can you train that part? I don't know. It's very likely that back in the 60s people have looked at it. But having looked over the literature, I haven't seen any training studies, which actually would be quite interesting. So maybe you have something.
Last week, Professor Kenyon was talking about binocular rivalry, where the eyes compete, and eventually one dominates, and that's the emissions report of the brain. When you're talking about like the cocktail party effect, is that a similar principle happening with the ears, or is there a similar principle?
I think to an extent. We know we have the right ear advantage for speech, which is usually attributed to left hemisphere being dominant for language. And so that's been all the studies. If you do even this, and you do right versus left ear statistically, you have, it's a small advantage, but it's there. I think that there isn't anything similar that I know in terms of this rivalry. I mean, you do get, if you have worse hearing in one ear, then more job is done by the other ear. And ears can actually, you know, you can rewire ears to each other, so the world sort of twists. And just like optically, you know, the experiment where you flip the world around and after some time the world flips back. You can do certain things, you know, there is adaptation, it's just not a sensory adapt. But I don't think that, I haven't heard the concept of like a lazy ear, you know, the same way you can have a lazy eye. At least, not that I am aware of. But one ear is definitely dominant for some things, you know, like music versus speech.